Now, let me just address some of the things about African culture that I think may be important for you to understand. Because one of the things that Nick said is that, hey, well, how do you explain the fact that if you go to Sub-Saharan Africa, they didn't have any written language, there were no two-story buildings, so forth and so on, very primitive culture. And this is one of the things he presents as proof, supposedly, that black people are just not as smart. An interesting thing about this is that I think we can actually, and there again, this is just me just providing some anecdotes that I think might be helpful to kind of understand this. Because once we understand, for example, the example from Dunbar, then we've got a good kind of baseline to say, all right, well, that's not necessarily true. Well, what might explain some of those civilization deficiencies, right, that we see in Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa? Because those are facts, right? We still see a lot of underdevelopment. Well, this is actually quite interesting because one of the things that might not be very widely known amongst people is that if you go to Africa, Africa has the highest density of linguistic diversity in the world. And then when I say the highest density, I mean it's not even close. In a single nation, they might have hundreds of languages spoken by the people there. And if you think about that, the United States is a country of 330 or some odd million people, and we all speak the same language. Now just think about countries a tenth of that size that might speak hundreds of languages among them. What this does is this makes the transfer of knowledge, the passing on of knowledge, and even the development of a written language makes it very, very difficult because you have these very, very small enclaves of people who literally cannot communicate with each other, or at least not communicate with each other at a high level. Basically, if you want to communicate with most people in your nation, you have to learn hundreds of languages, which is impossible. Now, what's really interesting about this is that if we look at the Bible, one of the things that we see is that at the Tower of Babel, when God said, he looked down at the people had a desire to build a tower to the heaven. And God said, if I don't basically go down and stop them, nothing will be impossible to them because they are on one accord. They're of one mind. And what that also meant is that they all spoke a common language. And when God wanted to slow down the progress in the Tower of Babel, the first thing he did, the only thing he did, was confuse their languages. And that was enough to stop them in their tracks. So they couldn't communicate, which put a barrier to the transfer of knowledge and their mutual cooperation. And at one point, when he said there's nothing would be impossible for them, then that made it so that they had to disperse, and all of the synergistic impact or the synergistic effects of an entire body of people functioning as a single unit. There's an interesting kind of phenomenon even in music where when you have a bunch of people harmonizing, there are these overtones that are produced, which are basically frequencies being produced by that harmony that no individual person is singing. And that's an interesting kind of concept because it translates to the idea of when human beings come together and function as one, they get this superpower where they're greater than the sum of their parts. Well, if you can divide people into many, many very, very small enclaves and subcultures, then it will have the opposite effect. And so I think one of the main reasons why we haven't seen a lot of development in Africa is because of the linguistic diversity. Now, this would be an interesting, in my opinion, it'd be an interesting PhD kind of project if anyone wanted to study and try to understand why are there so many languages in Africa. I mean, if you got like, there again, just like a few hundred or maybe a few thousand people speaking a single language that only they speak, or maybe a few other tribes might be vaguely familiar with. And I've talked to these people. Honestly, I know I have a lot of friends that are from Africa, and the native languages are I said, well, aren't they kind of like similar, kind of like Portuguese and Spanish? Can't you like make something that he was like, no, these languages are so different that they literally cannot communicate with people who live in their own country. So once again, good PhD project. Why there's so many languages in Africa. But when you, but then again, Dr. Soul kind of lays this all out because he tells a story in one of his books, and there's another one I also recommend called Discrimination and Disparities, where he talks about the Scots. In the 1400s, it was said that there was no Scottish baron who could even write his own name. They were illiterate, they couldn't write, and basically they were just an ignorant culture. But two things happened for the Scots. One was the Protestant Reformation, where everyone was encouraged to be literate so that they could read the Bible for themselves. And two was that they switched in their culture in the late 18th, 19th century from Gaelic to English. And England and English already had a large body of written knowledge that they could draw from that was previously inaccessible to them. And when that happened, the Scottish actually began to surpass the English in their intellectual achievements. People like Adam Smith, David Hume, some of the most prominent philosophers really in, the last millennia. They came from Scotland, but just 400 or 500 years prior to their emergence, these people were illiterate and backward. And all that it took to change that fate was the Protestant Reformation and a switch from Gaelic to English, where they had access to a larger body of written knowledge. And one of the concepts that Dr. Soul kind of explores in this discrimination and disparities is that there are prerequisites to success that even though any one of the prerequisites may be fairly common and easy to obtain, having all of them at the same time might actually be fairly uncommon. And this gives way to all kinds of strange phenomena and unequal distributions of outcomes. And it's the reason why you see kind of skewed achievement amongst certain groups.
Hey man, if you stuck around this long, that means you probably like my stuff. That means you should be a subscriber by definition. So go ahead and subscribe, go ahead and do that, and go ahead and hit that like button. Appreciate it.